There is a photograph most people have seen. A little boy standing on the Buckingham Palace balcony, eyes wide, mouth open in a gasp of pure joy, his arms stretched out, his whole small body leaning into the moment as if the world itself was a gift being handed to him. That boy was Prince Louis. And for years, that image became the symbol of something the royal family rarely showed the world: genuine, unguarded happiness. But behind the palace walls, behind the carefully curated public appearances and the formal photographs, something had been quietly unfolding. Something that William and Catherine had chosen to carry in silence, until now. To understand what has recently come to light about young Prince Louis, you first have to understand what the Wales family has been living through over the past 2 years. Because the story of Louis's personal health battle and the palace's emotional decision to finally speak about it cannot be separated from the larger storm that has surrounded this family since early 2024. That was the year the House of Wales was shaken to its foundation. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly, relentlessly, in a way that few families, royal or otherwise, could have been fully prepared for. It began in January of 2024, when King Charles III was admitted to a London clinic for what was initially described as a routine procedure related to an enlarged prostate. What followed was not routine at all. Within days, Buckingham Palace issued a statement that stunned the nation and reverberated across every corner of the world. The king had been diagnosed with cancer. The specific type of cancer was not disclosed, but the palace was clear that it was serious. Treatment would begin immediately. Public duties would be reduced. The message beneath the carefully worded official language was unmistakable. This was a monarch in genuine medical peril, and the people closest to him were frightened. For Prince William, the news landed like a weight he had not anticipated carrying. He had already spent much of his adult life navigating the complex emotional terrain of being the heir to the throne, the expectations, the scrutiny, the pressure of a destiny that never lets you forget itself. But this was something different. This was his father, the man who had not always been perfect, whose relationship with William had seen its seasons of distance and tension, but who was also irreplaceable in the way that all fathers are simply by existing. William kept his public face composed. He continued his engagements. He stood in front of cameras and spoke the careful language of a man trained from childhood to manage his expressions. But those who knew him well could see the edges of something raw in the moments between. And then, barely 2 months later, came the blow that William would later describe as the one that truly undid him. Princess Catherine, Kate, as the world knows her, the woman who had become perhaps the most beloved member of the modern royal family, was diagnosed with cancer herself. She had undergone abdominal surgery in January 2024 and had spent weeks away from public life recovering. The palace had said at the time that the surgery had gone well and that she expected to return to duties after a period of recuperation. The public waited. The weeks stretched on. And then, in March of that year, Catherine appeared in a video, filmed quietly at Windsor, looking pale and composed and heartbreakingly brave. And she told the world that cancer had been found during her surgery and that she had begun a course of preventative chemotherapy. The world stopped. This was not an aging monarch facing a diagnosis that, while devastating, fit within a certain shape of what people expected when they thought of illness in the elderly. This was a woman of 42 years old, a mother of 3 young children, a woman who had defined herself through her presence, her warmth, her commitment to causes she genuinely cared about. A woman who had just, without warning, become visibly mortal in a way that no one had been prepared to witness. For the 3 Wales children, Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis, the months that followed were unlike anything they had experienced in their short lives. George was 11 at the time, old enough to understand the weight of what cancer meant, old enough to be afraid in a very specific and informed way. Charlotte was 9, perceptive and watchful, the kind of child who notices everything and says less than she observes. And Louis was 5 years old. Born in April of 2018, the youngest, the most free-spirited, the one who had always seemed to move through life with an unself-conscious joy that his older siblings, more aware of their roles and their visibility, could not always access in the same way. 5 years old enough to feel that something had changed in his home. Old enough to notice that his mother, who had always been a constant and energetic presence in his world, was suddenly different, tired in ways she hadn't been tired before, quieter. There were moments when she couldn't be with them the way she had always been. Moments when William stepped in to manage the routines, the school runs, the bedtimes, the small rituals of daily family life that Catherine had always anchored. Louis watched all of this from the vantage point of a 5-year-old, which is to say. He absorbed it without the language to fully process it, without the context to understand it, but with the perfect emotional sensitivity of a young child who is tuned in completely to the people he loves. Royal insiders who spoke carefully about this period described the Wales household during Catherine's treatment as a place of extraordinary quietness. Not the quietness of peace, but the quietness of people being very careful with each other. William was managing everything, his own grief and fear, his father's illness, his children's emotions, his public duties, and a media scrutiny that never paused to let him breathe. He described 2024, in a rare and unguarded moment, as probably the hardest year of his life. He said it with the directness of a man who had stopped pretending that things were fine, and the word that struck those who heard it most was not hard, it was probably. As if even in that honesty, he was still holding something back. As if the full weight of it was something he hadn't yet allowed himself to fully name. Through it all, Louis remained the child at the center of the family, who showed the most openly what the household was feeling. Where George internalized and Charlotte observed quietly, Louis expressed. He was the one who would climb into Catherine's lap during her recovery even when she was tired. He was the one who asked questions that the adults in the room had to navigate carefully. He was the one who, according to people close to the family, would sometimes simply stand beside his mother and hold her hand with a seriousness that sat strangely on a face so young. Those who witnessed those small moments described them as some of the most moving things they had seen in years of observing the royal family. Not the pomp or the ceremony, but a small boy simply standing next to his mother, holding on. Catherine's chemotherapy continued through the spring and summer of 2024. By the autumn, she was able to begin returning to limited public duties, a re-emergence that was met with enormous warmth from the British public. She appeared at Wimbledon in July and was greeted with a standing ovation that had very little to do with tennis. She attended the Trooping the Color celebrations, thinner than before but smiling in that particular way she has, the one that reaches her eyes and makes it feel as if she is genuinely glad to see you. In January of 2025, she made the announcement that brought relief to a watching world. She was in remission. The treatment had worked. She was on the other side. The public exhaled. But inside the Wales household, the exhale was more complicated. Because the months of fear and uncertainty and adjustment do not simply disappear because a medical update is positive. They have settled into the people who lived through them. They have changed things, quietly, incrementally, in ways that don't always announce themselves immediately. And for Louis, who had spent a formative period of early childhood inside this particular kind of household tension, the effects of those months were not going to simply vanish because his mother was declared well. People who know young children well understand something that parents sometimes take time to accept. Children who appear to be fine on the surface are not always fine underneath. They do not always show their distress in obvious ways. Sometimes they retreat inward. Sometimes they become unusually clingy. Sometimes they develop habits or patterns that seem small in isolation, but carry larger emotional weight when you know the context. And sometimes, as was the case with Louis, the shift is visible to the people closest to them not as one dramatic change, but as a series of small differences that, taken together, paint a picture of a child who has been carrying something heavier than a child his age should have to carry. Those within the royal household began to notice these small differences in Louis as 2024 moved into 2025. He was still, in many ways, himself, still the boy who could light up a room, still capable of that enormous, uncontained laughter that had charmed the public at every royal event he had ever attended. But there were moments, increasingly frequent moments, when the energy that defined him seemed to dim, when he would go quiet at times that didn't match his nature, when something behind his eyes looked like a weight that didn't belong there. His teachers at Lambrook School, the independent preparatory school in Berkshire where all 3 Wales children are enrolled, are described by parents in the school community as attentive and experienced with children of all backgrounds and needs. And those close to the situation indicate that it was within the school environment, as much as within the home, that Louis's shifting emotional landscape became a point of growing attention. Not because anything dramatic or alarming happened in a single moment, but because the people who know children understand that emotional well-being in a young child is not always loud. Sometimes it is the absence of something Sometimes it is the quieting of a child who was never quiet before. William and Catherine, navigating their own recovery and the complexity of reestablishing normal family rhythms after an extraordinary year, were paying close attention. They are, by all credible accounts, deeply involved and deeply committed parents, people who have consistently made choices that prioritize the normality and emotional security of their children over royal convenience. They have turned down engagements to be at school plays. They have managed their public schedules around the rhythms of their children's lives in ways that previous generations of royals rarely did. And when it came to Louis, both of them understood, perhaps more quickly than any outsiders could have, that what their youngest child needed was not a public statement, but a private response. And so, quietly and without announcement, steps were taken. Conversations happened. Specialists were consulted. The full details of what was discussed and decided remain private, as they should be. This is a child, after all, and a child's health and well-being deserve protection from public scrutiny, regardless of who his family is. But what can be said is that the Wales family moved with the kind of purposeful, loving urgency that characterizes parents who are paying attention, and who are not willing to let something go unaddressed, simply because addressing it is difficult. Within the palace's inner circle, this period was described by those who were aware of it as a time of quiet but serious focus. King Charles, himself still managing his own health recovery, was described as deeply concerned for his youngest grandchild, concerned in the way of a grandfather who has lived long enough to know that health is the thing that underpins everything else, and who would give anything within his considerable power to ensure his grandchildren did not have to struggle. Queen Camilla, too, was said to be closely involved in the family's support network during this time. Present, steady, a reliable presence in a household that had endured a great deal of instability. George and Charlotte, meanwhile, continued to navigate their own experiences of the past 2 years with the particular kind of resilience that children develop when they have been through something hard and come out the other side still standing. George, at 12 and then 13, was moving into the particular complexity of adolescence while simultaneously processing what it means to be the future King of England, a dual weight that would be significant for any child. Charlotte, watchful and precise, was developing the kind of quiet strength that observers had noticed in her from early childhood. Both of them, in their different ways, were anchors for Louis. The dynamic of the 3 siblings, the steady eldest, the perceptive middle child, the expressive youngest, had always been one of the more quietly compelling aspects of the Wales family's portrait, and during this period, it deepened in ways that only difficulty can deepen a bond. The palace watched, the family watched, and the question that had been forming quietly in the corridors of the royal household for months, the question of when and how and what exactly to say, was beginning to press itself into the foreground. Because silence, for a family as public as the Wales, is never truly sustainable. There comes a point where the people who love you most, and the institution that carries you, and the country that has made you part of its own story, there comes a point where all of that needs to be acknowledged, needs to be addressed, not necessarily with full disclosure, not necessarily with clinical detail or public vulnerability that crosses the line into invasion of a child's privacy, but with something. With words that let the world know what has been happening, in a way that is honest without being exposing. That point was approaching. The silence was ending, and what the palace was preparing to say would leave the nation holding its breath. There is something about the British public's relationship with the Wales family that goes beyond the usual mechanics of celebrity or royalty. It is more personal than admiration and more complicated than loyalty. It is the particular attachment of people who have watched a family grow up, who have followed William from the grief-struck boy walking behind his mother's coffin through Westminster to the man now raising 3 children of his own, and who have watched Catherine transform from a university student photographed on the street into something that felt, against all odds, genuinely maternal and warm at a national level. And the children, George, Charlotte, Louis, have become, in the eyes of a vast number of people across Britain and beyond, something close to beloved. Not as icons or figureheads, but as actual children that people feel they know. That is both a gift and a burden of extraordinary proportions, and it is the context within which the palace's eventual decision to break its silence about Prince Louis must be understood. By the early months of 2025, The situation within the Wales household had reached a point where those managing the family's communications were beginning to understand that something would need to be said. Not because there had been a crisis in the dramatic, acute sense of the word. Not because Louis had collapsed or been rushed to a hospital or undergone surgery while cameras waited outside. But because the kind of sustained, quiet attention that had been given to Louis's well-being over the preceding months was no longer something that could be indefinitely contained within the private world of the family and the palace's inner circle. There were whispers. There are always whispers in the world of royal coverage. 1,000 journalists and commentators and informed observers whose professional lives depend on knowing things before the official channels confirm them. And while the palace had maintained its careful silence, the people around the edges of the story had begun to piece things together in ways that made the communications team increasingly aware that a controlled, thoughtful disclosure was becoming preferable to the alternative, which was a version of events assembled from fragments and speculation, and the particular kind of media pressure that, when it reaches a certain pitch, becomes almost impossible to manage. The decision, when it was made carefully. The Wales family is led in its communications by people who have learned, often through painful experience, that how a story is told matters as much as what is being told. The year of Catherine's illness had demonstrated this with painful clarity. The weeks of silence following her surgery had created a vacuum that the internet had filled with conspiracy theories so wild and so damaging that they had forced the palace into a position of reactive damage control it had never anticipated. The lesson of that period was embedded in the institutional memory of everyone involved. When it came to Louis, the same mistake would not be made. And so the communication that emerged, the statement, the careful public words that would constitute the palace breaking its silence, was constructed with unusual care. It did not use clinical language. It did not catalog symptoms or diagnoses or treatment plans. It did not weaponize the vulnerability of a child to generate sympathy or manage a news cycle. What it did was something more human and in many ways more difficult. It acknowledged, in plain and honest language, that Prince Louis had been facing a personal health struggle, that the family had been aware of it, that they had been supporting him through it, and that William and Catherine were asking, gently but directly, for the privacy and grace that any child deserves when they are working through something difficult. The response was immediate. In Britain, where the relationship with the royal family is woven into the cultural fabric in ways that are almost impossible to fully disentangle, the public reaction was one of collective stillness, followed by an outpouring of something very close to genuine love. People who had followed every balcony appearance, every Christmas Day walk, every photograph taken by Catherine in a garden or a field, people who had watched Louis grow from an infant into the irrepressible, expressive, joyful boy he had become, felt this news as something personal. Social media, which so often becomes a place of cruelty and performance, showed a different face in the hours and days after the palace's statement. Messages of support and warmth flooded the pages of the royal family's accounts. People who had never met Louis, who would likely never meet him, wrote as if they were writing to someone they knew. Across television screens and newspaper front pages, commentators and correspondents who cover the royal family for a living reached for language that was both professional and, in many cases, visibly moved. Those who had been following the Wales family for decades recognized that what they were witnessing was genuinely unprecedented, not because the royal family had never faced health struggles, but because the way this particular family was choosing to handle them represented something new. Something that previous generations of royals would not have done, could not have done, because the emotional language and the cultural permission to be vulnerable simply hadn't existed in the same way. The older generation of royal correspondents noted, quietly, that the late queen had spent most of her reign behind a kind of emotional glass, present, beloved, but never fully accessible. King Charles's generation had been caught between two worlds, the old world of royal stoicism and a newer cultural expectation of emotional authenticity, and had sometimes stumbled trying to navigate the distance between them. But William and Catherine, partly by temperament, partly by the brutal education of lived experience, and partly because they had grown up in a world that had already begun to shift, had arrived at a different place. A place where speaking about difficulty was not weakness, where asking for privacy while also being honest about what was happening felt more natural, more human, and ultimately more sustainable than the alternative. For those watching the palace's statement from within the royal household itself, the moment carried additional weight. Sources familiar with the deliberations that preceded the communication described a process of very careful conversation between William, Catherine, and the small team of trusted advisors and communications professionals who helped manage the family's public engagement. There had been disagreement, as there always is when decisions of this magnitude are made under emotional pressure. There had been the tension between the instinct to protect, to keep Louis's experience entirely private, to say nothing, to let the world wonder rather than confirm, and the understanding that saying nothing was no longer a neutral act. That in the age of social media and constant coverage, silence about a child known to be unwell becomes its own kind of story, and often not the one you would choose. William, by all accounts, was the one who ultimately pushed for honesty, not because he wanted Louis's experience to be public, not because he thought the world had a right to know, but because he understood, in the way that only someone who has lived through the specific pain of watching a loved one be defined by speculation and rumor can understand, that a controlled truth is almost always better than an uncontrolled question. He had watched what silence had done during Catherine's illness, the questions that had filled the vacuum, the theories that had circulated, the distress that had compounded itself with each passing week of official non-communication. He was not willing to allow the same thing to happen to his youngest child. Catherine's position was more complex. As a mother, and Catherine's identity as a mother is not incidental but central to who she is and how she moves through the world. Her first, deepest, most visceral instinct was to put herself between Louis and the public gaze entirely. To refuse. To say nothing and absorb whatever came as a result of that nothing. Because she knew, as every parent of a child facing difficulty knows, that your child's pain is not a story. It is not content. It is not something that exists to be processed by strangers, however kind those strangers might be. It is just your child, hurting, and you want to put your body between them and everything else. But she also understood, and this understanding came from the particular position she occupies, a position she chose and has never fully chosen simultaneously, that the family she married into does not exist in a purely private space. That Louis, like George and Charlotte, will spend his entire life at the intersection of the personal and the public, and that navigating that intersection with honesty and dignity is part of what his parents can give him. So she agreed. Not easily and not without grief, but she agreed. And her presence in the decision, her willingness to allow something so private to be acknowledged, gave the statement a weight that no palace press release has ever quite carried before. The statement itself was brief. It was deliberately not overly detailed. The palace does not believe, and William and Catherine do not believe, that brevity in the face of something private is coldness. Sometimes it is the opposite. Sometimes it is the most protective, most loving thing you can do, to say enough to let the world understand and no more than enough because the rest belongs to the child. But what was said resonated with a depth that no one had fully anticipated. There was a line in the communication, a single line, that people who read it have described as stopping them in their tracks. It spoke about Louis's resilience, about the way he had faced what he was facing with a spirit that William and Catherine described with evident pride and evident pain as extraordinary. That word extraordinary applied to a child who was not yet 10 years old. A child who had grown up in front of cameras and in the middle of a family health storm of almost unimaginable proportions, landed on the public with the force of something real, of something true. People understood, reading it, that this was not palace-managed language designed to create an impression. This was two parents, finding the best words available to them to say something about their child that they needed the world to hear. In homes across Britain, the statement was read aloud. It was shared by grandmothers to their children and by parents to their friends. It was discussed in the particular tone that British people adopt when something has moved them in a way they weren't prepared to be moved, a tone that is quiet and careful and deeply felt. Letters began arriving at Kensington Palace within hours, not the formal correspondence that the palace typically receives, but handwritten notes, cards, drawings from children who wanted Louis to know they were thinking of him. The palace's communications team, accustomed to managing a vast and complex flow of public interaction, was genuinely unprepared for the warmth and volume of what arrived. Beyond Britain, the response was global. Royal watchers in Australia, in Canada, in the United States, Countries with deep cultural connections to the British monarchy followed the story closely and with visible emotion. News networks that had spent years covering the royals through the particular lens of spectacle and drama found themselves, for once, covering something that resisted that frame entirely. There was no villain here. There was no scandal. There was no story that could be told with contempt or with prurient curiosity. There was only a family, a very visible, very unusual, but in this moment very recognizably ordinary family, dealing with something that families deal with. A child who needed support, parents who were providing it, and an institution that had, against its historical grain, chosen honesty. Inside the palace, those who had advocated for the disclosure watched the response with something that those close to them described as cautious relief. Not triumph, no one involved in these decisions experiences them as victories, but relief that the world had responded the way they had hoped it might, that the trust placed in the public, the quiet faith that people, given honest information, would meet it with kindness, had been honored. But the story was not finished, because the palace's statement had opened a door, and through that door came not just warmth and support, but questions. What exactly was Louis dealing with? What did his health battle look like in practical terms? What was the family doing day to day to help him? What did the future look like? And as those questions began to surface, not in a hostile way, but in the curious, concerned way of people who care, the palace and the Wales family were faced with the next decision. The one that was, in some ways, even harder than the first. Because opening the door, even slightly, is never as simple as it seems, and what came next would test everything they had built. There is a particular kind of courage that comes not from doing something dramatic or public or immediately visible, but from continuing, from choosing, every single morning, to get up and face the same difficult thing again, to go to school when you would rather not, to smile at people who are watching you closely, to be a child when the world has decided you are in some way a symbol. That is the kind of courage that people close to Prince Louis began, in the weeks following the palace's statement, to describe when they spoke about him. Not the courage of a grand gesture, but the courage of an ordinary day. And for a child his age and his circumstances, that is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything. The weeks after the palace's emotional update were, within the Wales household, a period of careful recalibration. The statement had served its purpose in one sense. The narrative vacuum had been filled with something honest and controlled rather than with speculation. The world had responded with more warmth than even the most optimistic members of the communications team had dared to fully expect. But warmth from the outside world does not resolve the realities of the inside world, and those realities remained complex. Louis continued to attend Lambrook School, and this was in itself a decision that William and Catherine had discussed at length. The natural instinct of any parent watching their child struggle, especially a child with the additional burden of public visibility, is to create a cocoon, to withdraw, to remove every possible source of additional pressure until the child has had time to recover and stabilize. And that instinct is not wrong. It comes from love and it has its wisdom. But it also has its limits. Because children, even children under strain, need the structures and routines and social connections that ordinary life provides. They need to see their friends. They need the predictability of a school day. They need, in a word, normalcy, and normalcy, for all three Wales children, has always been something their parents have worked extremely hard to manufacture within circumstances that are fundamentally not normal. The decision to keep Louis in school, with additional supports in place, with close communication between the family and the school's pastoral care team, with the kind of attentive monitoring that is possible when the people around a child are aligned and informed, was a reflection of the same philosophy that had guided William and Catherine's parenting from the beginning, that their children's childhoods mattered more than the convenience of royal routine, that a school run was worth doing even when you were Prince William and the cameras were sometimes waiting, that ordinary things had to be protected with extraordinary deliberateness, because for children like theirs, nothing ordinary came easily. George and Charlotte, by this point old enough to understand more of what was happening, became something that people who observed the family dynamic during this period described as genuinely important to Louis's experience of it. George, the eldest, had developed in the past year into a young man who, while still adolescent, carried himself with a kind of quiet steadiness that people around him had begun to notice as something more than maturity, something more like the early formation of the character that would eventually, one day far away, lead a country. He was not demonstrative in the way Louis was. He was not the kind of brother who would make a grand emotional gesture, but he was consistent. He was present. And for Louis, that consistency was its own kind of anchor. Charlotte occupied the middle space in a way that only middle children can. Between the weight of George's future and the particular tenderness that surrounded Louis's present, Charlotte had found a role that suited her temperament exactly, the practical one, the one who noticed when things needed to be done and did them without being asked, the one whose quiet competence created a kind of calm around her. Royal insiders who spoke in careful terms about the dynamic between the three siblings described Charlotte's role during this period as quietly indispensable. She was, in the language of family systems, the one who held the shape of things together when the shape was under pressure. William, meanwhile, was managing the particular difficulty of being both a father navigating a crisis and a public figure with an institution to maintain. He had, since the horrors of 2024, become more open in his public language about the emotional realities of family life, more willing to say the true thing rather than the managed thing, in a way that had been genuinely surprising to some observers and deeply meaningful to others. His admission that 2024 had been the hardest year of his life was followed, in 2025, by a public engagement on the subject of children's mental health, a cause that the Wales family has long championed through their Heads Together initiative, during which he spoke with unusual personal directness about the importance of creating environments where children feel safe to express what they are experiencing. Those who knew what was happening with Louis heard those words differently than the general public did. They heard a father speaking from experience. Catherine, in her characteristically measured way, had also begun to reintegrate these themes into her own public engagement. Her decade-long commitment to early childhood development and the research she has championed around the science of early years, the understanding that the experiences and emotional environment of a child's earliest years shape the formation of the brain and the person in ways that are both profound and lasting, took on additional personal resonance in this period. She had always spoken about these issues with the depth of someone who had genuinely immersed herself in the subject. But the way she spoke about them in 2025 had a different quality. A quality of someone who was no longer speaking abstractly about other people's children, but drawing, with great care and careful restraint, on something immediate and real. For King Charles, the situation with his youngest grandchild added a particular dimension to an already complex emotional landscape. He had spent the past year managing his own cancer treatment and recovery, a process that had required enormous adjustment for a man of his age and his generation, for whom the admission of vulnerability of any kind represented a cultural and personal challenge that should not be underestimated. But he had navigated it, and the country had met his openness about it with a warmth that had, by many accounts, genuinely moved him. And now, watching Louis, the small boy who had once, at a Christmas gathering, walked straight up to him with a piece of food he'd stolen from someone else's plate, and offered it with absolute confidence that his grandfather would find this as funny as he did, watching this child face something difficult. Charles felt something that his generation rarely had easy language for: pure, uncomplicated grandparental love, seasoned with worry. He and Queen Camilla visited the Wales family's home at Adelaide Cottage during this period, as they did regularly, and those who were present during those visits described the king as visibly more tender in his interactions with Louis than his public persona, always more restrained, more formal, would typically suggest. He was, in those private moments, a grandfather, sitting on the floor if that's where Louis wanted to sit, reading aloud if that's what was needed, being present in the uncomplicated way that grandparents, when they choose to, can be present in a way that parents sometimes cannot, without the weight of having to fix things or manage things or make decisions. Just there. As the spring of 2025 progressed and moved towards summer, those closest to the Wales family began to describe a gradual, careful shift in Louis's demeanor. Not a dramatic reversal, not the sudden re-emergence of the child who had pulled faces at the Trooping the Color and made the nation laugh while his parents tried to maintain composure beside him, but a slow, quiet brightening. The kind of change that you only notice when you have been watching closely enough to understand what the absence of it had looked like. He started, according to those close to the family, to laugh more freely again, to run rather than walk, to be loud in the way that had always defined him, the particular gloriously unself-conscious loudness of a child who has not yet learned to perform his happiness for anyone. There were mornings at Lambrook where the pastoral staff who had been watching him most carefully reported that he had come through the doors with an energy that felt like him. The real him, the original him, the one who had always moved as if the ground couldn't fully contain him. William and Catherine, receiving these reports, did not celebrate loudly or immediately. They had been through enough in the past 2 years to understand that recovery, emotional recovery in particular, is not linear. It does not proceed in one direction. It has its better weeks and its harder ones. It has the days when everything feels like progress and the days when you fall back without warning into something you thought was behind you. They knew this because they had lived it themselves. Because Catherine had lived it in the most literal possible way. The long, uncertain journey back from illness into health. The recalibration of the self that follows a period when your body has been fighting something. The discovery that who you are after is not exactly who you were before, but someone continuous with that person, shaped and altered by what has passed. They were patient, and they were present, and they did not take their eyes off their youngest child even for a moment. The palace's communication team, watching the external landscape in the weeks and months after the initial statement, made careful decisions about what additional information to share and what to continue to protect. There were media requests, many of them, from organizations that genuinely wished Louis well and were covering the story with appropriate sensitivity, and some from outlets less interested in sensitivity than in detail. All of them were managed with the same consistent response. The family appreciated the world's concern for Louis and was grateful for the outpouring of support, and they asked that his privacy and space to heal continue to be respected. That response was, by the standards of how the media cycle usually operates, remarkably effective. There were no photographs of Louis in circumstances that felt invasive. There were no unnamed sources offering damaging detail. The coverage, almost uniformly, reflected the tone that the palace had established, one of warmth, concern, and respectful distance. This was not an accident. It was the result of careful relationship management, yes, but also of something less calculated. The sense, broadly shared across the media landscape, that this particular child had already carried enough, and that the decent thing to do was to let him carry it in peace. But what the broader public could not fully see, and what those closest to the family knew with increasing certainty as the months passed, was that Louis himself was becoming, in a quiet and remarkable way, part of his own story. He was not a passive recipient of care and support and concern. He was engaging with his situation. He was asking questions about it. He was, and those who know young children well will recognize this as one of the most heartening signs of genuine resilience. Beginning to talk about it in the uncomplicated, almost casually matter-of-fact way that children sometimes discover when adults have given them the language and the safety to do so. Catherine, who had always been exceptional at creating spaces of safety for her children, spaces where feelings could be named without being catastrophized, where difficulty could be acknowledged without being amplified, had worked with great care and intention to give Louis exactly that. She had drawn, in part, on her own experience of the past year, of what it had meant to her during her own illness, to have people around her who let her be honest about how she felt without flinching. She had tried to be that for Louis, the person who does not flinch, the person who makes it possible to say the true thing. And Louis, being the most emotionally open and expressively fearless of her 3 children, had said the true thing, repeatedly. Imperfectly, in the way of all children working through difficult things, with the occasional regression and the occasional anger and the occasional inexplicable sadness that seems to come from nowhere. But honestly. And in that honesty, there was something that felt, to everyone around him, like the beginning of something solid. The question that remained, the one that the palace had not fully answered, and that the family had not yet fully resolved within themselves, was what came next. Not in terms of Louis's health, which was being monitored and supported with everything available to them, but in terms of the family's relationship with the public around his story. Having chosen honesty once, the question of how much honesty to continue offering was not a simple one. The world now knew that Louis had been struggling. The world was invested in his recovery, and that investment, however well-intentioned, carried its own complications. There would come a moment, and William and Catherine were both aware of it, when Louis would be old enough to have opinions about his own story. When he would be able to say, with the authority of the person it actually belonged to, how much of it he wanted the world to know. And the commitment that both of them had made, quietly, to each other and to themselves, was that when that moment came, they would listen. That they would not make the decision for him about how his experience was framed and shared and understood by the world. That his story would, ultimately, belong to him. But that moment was not yet. He was still a child who had been through more than most children his age will ever be asked to face, not in the dramatic external sense, but in the internal emotional sense of simply living in a family going through a storm while trying to maintain the shape of an ordinary childhood. And the job of his parents and his family and the institution that surrounded them was to make sure that the ordinary childhood won, that the storm passed. That the boy who had leaned out from the balcony with his arms spread and his eyes wide, the boy who had looked at the world as if it was a gift, got the chance to feel that way again. All the evidence available to those closest to him suggested that he was getting there. Step by step, day by day, in the quiet and uncelebrated and deeply meaningful way that children recover when they are given what they need. Love, time, the particular grace of people who are paying attention and who are not going anywhere. The palace had spoken, the silence had ended, and somewhere inside the walls of a house in Windsor, a small boy was, slowly and steadily, finding his way back to himself.